What do you call a webhook in React? A React hook, of course. Hi guys, in this video we'll be going over what React hooks are and some examples of React basic hooks. So in simple terms, React hooks are a way for functional components to attach themselves to the React lifecycle and state system. The purpose of React hooks are to provide functional components, an alternative approach to maintaining state, and this is because they're inherently stateless by default. So before getting into React hooks, you might be asking, what's the React lifecycle? Well, it's a series of changes in the React framework that consist of three phases. So there's mounting, there's updating, and there's unmounting. So let's go through each of these phases briefly. And here is a cool diagram showing these three phases and all the functions that will be called or are part of each phase. As you see, some functions get carried over into multiple phases, so that it's not perfectly starting in one phase and ending in the same phase. So first we'll go over mounting. So what is mounting? So mounting is the simple act of inserting React elements into the DOM. The DOM is the document object model, and it's basically the web page. Within this phase, there's three notable methods that are called. First being the constructor. So this is a constructor. And this method should be familiar to those coming from a OOP background, so object-oriented programming background. And it's literally responsible for constructing the object by initializing the state of the object, as denoted from this.state. And it's only available for use in class components, so a class component, and not a functional component. So functional components don't have the ability to use the state constructor method. They instead use some of the hooks that we'll discuss later on in the video. Second in line is the render method. And this method is pretty self-explanatory in that it just renders these HTML or JSX or React elements onto the DOM as you see here. Um, let's move on. And this render method carries over to the updating and updating phase as well. Next, we have component did mount. And component did mount is basically called right after the component is rendered into the DOM. It's mainly used to run code that's required for the elements to be present in the DOM. And then, so right here in this example, we're just console logging a simple statement, but once we know that the elements are rendered, we can do anything we want with those elements in this lifecycle method. So second phase, moving on to the second phase is updating. And this updating phase is primarily concerned with updating the component whenever a change in state or change in props is detected. Like with the mounting phase, there's two notable methods in this phase. So there's the should component update, should component update, which is this method right here. And this is basically somewhat how it sounds like. So this is used to specify whether the React should update the component or not. So if you return true, it means yes, update. If you return false, it means no, don't update. So you can explicitly specify to React whether you want the component to be updated or not. And if it is updated, it will go through these lifecycle methods so that you can use those methods or hooks to um, do whatever you want. So next up is component did update. So this is completed. This is executed when the component has finished updating. So similar to component did mount, this will be executed at the end of the phase. So let's see right here. around here towards the end of updating phase, component did mount will be updated. And it's basically whenever a change to a component has been made, this will be called after the update phase is triggered and executed. Um, and note that the components are available for updating right after they're mounted. So right after they're mounted, they can be updated, um, meaning it's like milliseconds right after it's mounted, they can be updated. So you don't necessarily have to wait until the user sees the components in the browser. As a practical example, let's say you have a car component that has been mounted. It'll contain a state variable called car color that was changed from red to white right after the component was finished mounting. Subsequently, the update phase is triggered, and because the state variable changed from red to white, the component will go through the update phase, and then the component did update method will be called. So here's an example of what I mean. And here's my blog post, which I'll link to in the video description. Uh, but what I'm talking about is right here. So component did mount. We changed the car color to white, and then that'll trigger the update phase. So now it'll go to the update lifecycle method, and then it'll say this the car color is white because it was changed here. So that's basically the update phase. Next up is the unmounting phase. So the unmounting phase is the simplest of all three phases because all it does is remove the component from the DOM. And this is referred to as unmounting. The only notable method that will be executed is component will unmount. So this lifecycle method will be executed, and basically it'll be called right before the component is about to be unmounted, uh, kind of like a last chance for you to call something or do an action before the component unmounts. Okay, so enough about React Lifecycle. Now let's go over the main topic, which is React Basic Hooks. So React Basic Hooks, there's three main hooks or basic hooks that we'll cover. So React has two types of hooks. There's basic hooks, and then there's other hooks that are additions on top of extra hooks. And it's when understanding hooks, it's good to start with React basic hooks so that you have a firm understanding and foundation of what they are. So you can carry on learning about other hooks. So I'll give some quick examples about some React basic hooks. So the first one is React useState hook. And this state hook is basically um, what is shown right here. So let's go over an example here. So in this example, you can see we have a functional component called login. It has email, password, fields as the state. And the way we know it's part of the state is because you have the useState hook. So the state hook is basically the useState React hook. And what it does is right now it defines the email variable. It assigns it this value. So it looks in local storage and tries to get a hook's email address that's stored in local storage. So in case you didn't know, local storage is a storage mechanism that can be seen right here. So local storage, and then there's session storage. The difference is local storage will store the session, so will store the data after you exit from the browser, whereas session storage will delete the data when you exit the browser. So it's just a form of storage. And now let's say we don't find hook's email variable in local storage, then it'll assign an empty string as the email fields of value. And then it also defines a setter. So set email to whatever we want. We'll see how this is used later. And then same thing for password. Uh, and
Password.
then,
Set password equals useState.
sorry about that. Uh, then we have a set item. And then over here, we can see an event listener. And we're basically saying on change. If these input values change, then we call a set email and we give it the target value that was entered into this input field. Same with the password. If the password changed, take the value that was entered into the password field and assign it to password using that set password setter method. So basically, it's pretty simple to understand, and that is the state hook. So next is the effect hook. So effect hook is basically a React use effect, and it's basically a way to run React side effects while preserving a certain degree of independence from the component's rendering cycle. So in other words, React hooks allow side effects to be run separately from the rendering of the component. So if you're confused, don't worry, we'll go over a code example soon. But first, what's a React side effect, you might be wondering? Well, a side effect is basically any code that affects something outside the scope of a given functional component that will be run. Examples of side effects include, let's say, GraphQL queries, um, like use, where's this? Let me show you here. So we have, yeah, so this is a GraphQL query that's being used. So this is an example of a side effect, or making an API request using Axios, or manually inserting or deleting React elements from the DOM. So those are examples of what side effects are. And now I'll go over an example of React hook. So basically, you have this uh, example right here, and we use React, we use a useEffect function or hook to use Axios to call an endpoint. We're getting the most famous cars and 20 of the most famous cars, and then we're setting the result using the set car list, which is done using useState, so the state hook. So basically, this useEffect hook will be called initially right after the component has mounted. But then it'll only run right after the component has mounted. It won't run any other subsequent times. And that's because we passed the second argument as an empty array. So this basically means run this first callback function, run this callback function right after the component has mounted, but then after that, don't ever run it again. So that's what this means. And then, so now there's a second example where we can see function bike, and we have use effect, and then inside the second argument we're passing in price. So in this case, what will happen is if anywhere in the functions functional components lifecycle we call set price, and we somehow manipulate or change the value of price, then the use effect hook will be run. So the first callback function will be run, and it'll console log, the bike's price is this. So this will be the new price. So this basically stands for, whatever you pass into the second argument, whenever that changes, this first callback function will always be run. And um, this method, when you pass in something here, this won't run right after the component has mounted. So It'll only run when the price variable's value has changed. Okay, so that's use effect. So there's a bit more nuance and a bit more details to the use effect React hook, but this is the basic idea of how it's used. And finally, third on the list is use context. So use context is a bit more complex than the other two. So this can be thought of as a way for React components to access React context. And React context, which we'll cover soon, it React use context, which is the context hook. It requires React.create object, React.create context object as its primary parameter, and returns the current context value assigned to that context. So, so let's see. Uh, Yeah, so you have user context, you call react.create context, and then you pass in use context and you pass in that context. So you need to call create context prior to using use context. So now let's briefly talk about React context. So what is context? So context is basically an object that allows the passing of data through the component tree without having to use props. So traditionally you had to, if you wanted React props, if you wanted to use props and let me see. If you want to use props, you had to pass it through a bunch of components. So let's say you have app component. It has some data that it wants to pass to the profile component. It had to it has to use props and then send it to dashboard, settings, and then finally profile. So that's a lot of unnecessary work because dashboard and settings did not require that props. Only profile required that props data. So that's a lot of inefficiencies that was present in the traditional way of React props. As a workaround for this, the React team has created React context. And context is basically you define the context here and you use a provider to access the context defined here in profile component, or you could do it in payment form, you could do it in menu, user menu dropdown, you could do it in header, you could do it in settings, you could do it anywhere in the component tree, and you don't have to have that waterfall trickle down inefficiency that's present in props. So it's a much more efficient way of handling data transfer and unidirectional data flow. So, so yeah, context objects can share data on a global level instead of having to traverse the component tree. So now let's see an example of context uh, use context and well, first of all, context. So let's see an example of context. So right here, this is a code sandbox IO example. I'll link this in the description if you want to see. And basically, it uses context to update the number of times I ran this month. So if you say log your run, it increments it. And the way it's doing this is it's using a provider which is essentially a part of create context. So first we create a context called run context. Then we use a provider, so run context.provider, and then we use this reducer. So a reducer is a method that performs a calculation, and what this is doing is based on the action type, whether it being increment or decrement. In the case of increment, we're incrementing the state of state.count by 1. And if it's decrement, we decrement the count variable by -1. Now, and if it's none of these, then we just throw an error. So it's basically doing a calculation. Now we have use count or count reducer, and then we set this count reducer to this state and then the dispatch. So whenever you call dispatch, you will run this count reducer reducing logic. So now you use the provider and you pass in this value, which is state and then dispatch. And now you use use count, uh, and use count will be used later on. We're basically exporting this, and use count is basically using that context, using the use context React hook, and we are returning that context. So whenever you use count, you'll get back the run context that is defined right here. So next, when we go to the count.js file, we can see run display. This is basically what you see here, and it's using count. Count is a state variable that is controlled by use count. So use count, as you recall from here, is using that provider, and that provider is using this reducer to calculate whether or not it needs to be incremented or not. So over here, we can see function use counter, and on button click. So on button click, we use the dispatch method. So again, as we covered, when we call dispatch, we actually call this reducer method. And since we pass in the type of increment, when we go over to the reducer, it scans the action, and then we can see its increment. So it increments it by +1, and that's why it always increments in value instead of decrementing. So we're incrementing the value on each button click. And now to put these components and this example together, we export it. And if we go to our index file, we can see run provider. So whenever using React context and use context hooks, we have to encapsulate this the components that are involved in a provider, in a in a React.context provider, and that is being exported right here. So run provider, that's actually a run context.provider, and then run providers encapsulates run display, which is this display right here, and then counter, which is this button. So counter is the button. And then whenever we click this, it increments. So it's quite a bit more complex example, but it's well worth understanding how React context works and the use context hook works. And note that these hooks, so use count, use context, these hooks can only be used in functional components. So as you see here, this is a function. It's a component, but it's a functional component. It's not a class component. So this example is fully functional component based. In class components, you won't be able to use React hooks. They're only native or unique to functional components. So basically, that's all I wanted to cover in this video. If you have any questions or need more clarification, please feel free to comment below. Or if you have any criticisms or advice on what I should do to improve, please post in the comments below. I will provide examples of what I use. So this is my code example. I'll link this as well along with my blog post in the video description. And thanks so much for watching. If you found it helpful, you can like and subscribe to my YouTube video and my YouTube channel. That's all, and see you guys in the next video.